I didn't learn this, and I don't know how to think about changing the context of race in this country without information.
Welcome to The Race to Social Justice, a podcast that explores the myriad racial and social challenges facing the modern world, with your hosts, Kiva White and John Kepner. Thank you for being part of the courageous conversation, because when it comes to combating social injustices in America, it is not about being confrontational. It is about being conversational.
Well, welcome everyone to our Race to Social Justice podcast series. I am Kiva White, and as you can see, I am the black guy.
And I'm John Kepner. I'm the white guy. Kiva and I share the love of the letter K. K for Kiva, K for Kepner, and most importantly, K for knowledge, what we try to impart in these podcasts, what Kiva calls the K factor. The goal of our podcasts, just to remind our listeners, is to promote racial and social equity and justice through honest and sometimes even difficult conversations and dialogue, what we call courageous conversations. Kiva and I have found that our discussions with each other have deepened our respective understandings of racism and our personal responsibilities in that regard. This led us to invite guests to share their honest experiences and learnings. We hope our conversations will help our listeners and even our guests on their own personal journeys.
Our guest for today is Jean Pfaelzer. Jean Pfaelzer is a public historian, commentator, and professor of American Studies at the University of Delaware. Her books include Driven Out, The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans, which was named one of New York Times' notable books of the year. Rebecca Harding Davis, Origins of Social Realism and the Utopian Novel in America. In her new book, California, a Slave State, Jean reveals the untold story of California as a state that was built on slavery, shredding the state's utopia brand. Jean lives in Washington, D.C., and it's a delight and pleasure to welcome you on the show today, Jean. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure seeing you here and having you in this discussion as we continue to have these discussions as we race towards a more just and social society. So, Jean, we always like to start these conversations off with having our guests share a little bit about their origin story. So can you tell us about your childhood growing up, where you lived, your parents, what you did as a kid, just a little bit about your origin story. Let's set the stage from there.
I was born in Los Angeles. I went through the LA public school system, went to Hamilton High in West LA. My parents were immigrants. My mom was born in New Zealand. My dad was born in the Ukraine and was part of a vicious pogrom of Jewish people from the Ukraine. We've now found his little village, which was right between, on a triangle, between Kyiv and Chernobyl. So having found that village, we wonder if it's still there. My Uncle Benny was drafted into the Tsar's army when he was 16, and there were 11 kids, 7 of them boys, stacked up behind him, all of whom would have been drafted. And to be in the Tsar's army would have been to have been a slave to the Tsar. And when he got that draft notice, the family escaped. They were very, very poor. They lived in a one-room basement in Brooklyn. And part of my dad's decision to live in California was that his kids would get a free college education. He had to drop out of school when he was 14. So wow. That's the family I grew up in. During the Depression, my dad was a traveling salesman, a Willy Loman, and he was devotedly self-educated. He spent the Depression in small town libraries, wherever the train would stop. And the librarians gave my dad a real traditional education. They wanted this little kid to read Dickens complete and stuff I never read complete.
Wow. I love every time we do one of these shows and I listen to someone's origin story, it just really, touches my heart and my soul, because I have this mantra that I utilize in one of my trainings I do for professionals to raise awareness about cross-cultural relationships. And I always say it's important for us to celebrate similarities and embrace difference. And I think that's a great way to enhance cross-cultural relationships. And even hearing your story here, I hear so much similarities in your upbringing, my childhood, some of the previous guests' childhood, and some of the struggles and some of the triumphs. And I think that's what makes us a great society, when we can get to the point where we can celebrate our similarities and embrace our difference. And it only can happen when we have discussions like this. So I really appreciate you sharing, and taking us, on the journey of your upbringing and some of your cultural history. Thank you so much.
So, Gene, can you trace that origin story to what's become your professional calling and what you're doing today, and even the book that we're going to be discussing in depth?
Sure, thank you. My origin story is as an immigrant's daughter who grew up the daughter of a very small business with a little jewelry store in Santa Monica. And my dad's mantra for my brother, my sister, and myself was pick any school in California, go to Berkeley. And that was one sentence. And we marched as immigrant kids do. We were pretty obedient. We marched in line with that. And when I was at Berkeley, I was blessed to study with the best. And in American Studies, I read Frederick Douglass for the first time, and I double majored in English and history, and I got to be the student of Kenneth Stamp, who was one of the early scholars in slavery history. But I didn't learn any of this. I did not learn the history of the West. I didn't learn the extent of slavery in the United States. I didn't learn how permeable slavery was in the US North. And I certainly didn't learn how it traveled west. So as I stumbled on these stories, and stumbled probably diminishes it a bit, but as I learned these stories, I felt that I had to take each one further. And then as I understood the various forms of human bondage in California and the American West, I began to see differences, but rather terrifying overlays. So as I drew them together, I knew it was a story I had to tell.
So you're a public historian, and we're going to dive into some aspects of your book. In your opinion, as a public historian, why is it important? Why is it essential for us to uncover hidden histories? Because this thing of slavery, it seems like in certain minds of American, we want to like, let's just forget about that. Why do we keep bringing this up? Why do we keep talking about this? Let's let the past be the past. But as a historian, isn't a historian or history meant to be preserved? So can you just talk a little bit about the importance of uncovering history?
I hope so. I think to preserve it, Kiva, maybe atrophies it. We're not thinking of peaches in a jar. It's that we are living this history right now.
Right.
And unless we understand its origins, the sources of power, the commonalities, and the particular differences of human bondage in this country, we're going to keep on that path and not figure out how to take it apart. One of to my mind, the important things that I learned in writing California, a Slave State, is that over the 250 years of slavery in California, at every single moment, there were slave revolts and slave resistance. During this rather vexed and difficult moment, as we see states like Florida and Texas try to erase this history very deliberately and legislate the erasure of this history, I think I've gone into some very dark moments. We probably all have, about the future of our country, for ourselves, for our families and communities. And oddly, this book has given me a great deal of hope in my most bleak moment, to realize that people who were suffering in ways that I, as this white woman, will never fully absorb or understand, people who were really brutally whipped and sold and chained, managed to revolt and managed to find freedom. And when I'm in my darkest moment, I actually return to my book.
Wow.
So that's really interesting, because we often end our podcast with asking our guests about hope. So you've accelerated that. But I'm just so eager to hear you talk about the book. So why this book? Why now? And what's the book about?
This book began with a couple of stories that, one was a little photograph. And I found the photograph for my last book, Driven Out: The Forgotten War Against Chinese Americans, which is the history of over 300 purges of Chinese Americans across the Pacific Northwest. And in doing that story, I came upon a little photograph. It was handed to me by a local photography historian, one of those wonderful people who make our work possible. And it's of a Chinese girl. She looks like she's about 12, 14, and she's in a cage. And it turns out that the cage would have been on Jackson Street, which flows into what's now Grant Avenue, San Francisco. I won't sing Grant Avenue, San Francisco, but it's this image of this little girl staring at me from behind a cage. And she was a kidnapped child prostitute, kidnapped from the port city, probably of Guangdong, of Canton in China, brought sometime after the gold rush, likely in a padded crate, certainly in the hold of a ship, and sold on the docks of San Francisco. And as we think about slave dens in the South or slave docks along the Mississippi, we don't think San Francisco Bay, or at least I didn't think San Francisco Bay. She would have been taken off the boat when she arrived and strip searched and sold or auctioned to a brothel owned by the Chinese merchant class in San Francisco. So that makes the story even more vexed. And if she wasn't sold immediately on the dock, she would have been taken to a room in Chinatown called the Queen's Room. It's a slave den, and would have been sold there and locked in these brothels, this row of brothels on Jackson Street. And as I looked at her staring at me from behind this cage, I found out that she would have been forced to solicit men who would pass by this very, very busy street in San Francisco. A curtain would have been drawn. She would have serviced sometimes up to 20 men a day. And then her madam or pimp, who was the wife of a Chinese merchant, would have collected the money, drawn the curtain, and she would have been forced to do this over and over again. So as a woman and as a mom of two daughters, it was unthinkable for me to think about 20 rapes a day. And so I looked at that picture and I kept saying, what happened to the 13th Amendment? What happened to the 13th Amendment? And that was one of the bookends. It isn't the beginning chronologically, but inside my heart and mind and soul, that was one of the bookends. The other one was something I read in a local newspaper in Northern California. I read in the local Eureka Times-Standard. Eureka is a lumber fishing town and now one of the cornerstones of the Emerald Triangle, the marijuana capital of the world. In Eureka, I read that a 15-year-old girl had been kept in a crate. She was homeless and wandering the streets of Hollywood and was picked up by a couple of guys who drove her north, the length of the state, into an inland county called Lake County. It's hot, and it's one of the centers of the cannabis industry, the cannabis grows. They put this girl in a metal crate and drilled 2 holes in it, one to prod her and one to hose her down. She was let out to sexually service the field workers and the owners. And then sometime in August, September, forced to trim the buds of the marijuana plants. One day, the men take her down to Sacramento, California's state capital, and they're going shopping, and they lock her in a motel room while they go shopping. She sees a telephone. She instantly dials 911 and frees herself. And I am haunted by a few things. One is her incredible courage to, in that moment, this traumatized child, to know how to free herself, which she does. The guys are prosecuted, they go to jail. And also that because she was 15, we don't know her name. And there are so many enslaved people whose names we are trying to find now, whose names we don't know. And again, I ask myself, what happened to the 13th Amendment? What happened to this was just a few years ago. I thought slavery was supposed to be abolished. What happened to the 13th Amendment?
Wow.
So could you take us back to the beginning, the early history of California? You see, I get the impression that the book connects all these several different kinds of slavery, but a continuum. You mentioned what's still happening today. Could you go back to the beginning and walk us chronologically?
Sure. It's a vexed story. It may be a trigger story for some of your listeners. It begins with the Spanish invasion of California. Growing up in California, I didn't really think of it as a colony of empire, but California begins as a colony of Spain. In 1769, just as in the East, people are beginning to think about independence and freedom. In 1769, Spain invades California, just at San Diego, the largest city in southern California, 20 miles from the Mexican border. Father Junipero Serra invades California with 8 fanatical priests and 100 Spanish soldiers. They are carrying a papal bull, an order from the Pope, and an order from the Emperor of Spain to convert Native Americans, to seize their land, especially the coastal land, to grow food, to support the silver mines in Mexico and Peru, and to start this chain of 21 missions. Now they're tourist attractions. Now they're the clone for Taco Bell architecture and very expensive mission furniture, this heavy, beautiful, solid furniture. But they were slave plantations where they were kidnapped, sometimes by rope around their neck and taken from their tribal villages to the missions, or the Spanish let loose their cattle and horses. California tribal people didn't have the horse, and they let loose their cattle and horses on the tribe's seed fields, and the cattle trampled the fields, they spoiled the fields, and starved. These were fields to bring the cattle, to bring the deer, the elk, the wild goats to the fields and kill them there because they didn't have the horse to go find them and bring these heavy animals back for food. And so people went into the missions because they were starving. They were starving on their own very fertile, beautiful land of deer or salmon or berries or cama bulbs. So that's the first story. And the tribal people at these 21 missions along the coast of California were brutalized, they were raped, they were starved, they were humiliated. Junipero Serra, who becomes the first Spanish saint, who lived within the United States, knows exactly what's happening. He's writing to the Mother Church in Mexico, we're not going to pull this off as long as the Spanish soldiers and the priests are raping Native women. He knew exactly the vortex of where this was empowered and how it worked and what put the whole mission project in jeopardy. So that's the launch. California was born as a slave state, and it was supported by the government of Spain that owned Alta, or California from the border up to Oregon. And it was done with force, with brutality. Certain crimes against the missions, you got whipped 20, you got flogged 20 times. Certain sins, you got flogged 50 times. Sins of homosexuality, sins of disobedience, sins of not honoring certain chants or prayer times during the day. So that's the origin and the first wave of slavery in California. The second I knew nothing about. It's developed in the book, but as the Russians cross Alaska for the otter fur trade, they're kidnapping Alaska natives who are the only people who know how to slaughter the sea otter. The sea otter has 1 million hairs per square inch. It is the silkiest, furriest, warmest, and it tastes horrible. It was not food. But the indigenous Alaska people knew that it kept them warm, and they killed only what they needed. And when the Russians have decimated the Alaska Native coastal tribes and wiped out the otters, they turn right and they head south, and they enter the cold waters of California to hunt the otters and sell them to China. So you've got a West Coast slave triangle: Alaska, California, China, for one product. And it's also where slavery meets the environment with the decimation of the otters. the Alaska natives were dumped. The Russians were really scared of the Spanish, and so they dropped the Alaska natives on these remote outcroppings right off San Francisco Bay, the Farallon Islands, and they leave them there for 6 months to slaughter the otters. They have brought their kayaks with them, they're forced to, and they bring Alaska Native women because they're the ones who can stitch the skins of the seals and to make these incredible waterproof suits for the otter hunters. REI had nothing on these waterproof suits to protect the hunters in hunting the otter in the cold waters of the Pacific. So the Alaska Natives are the first slaves brought into California, transported into California.
Are there, you gave us a nice historical overview of slavery on the West Coast. I know my ancestors were enslaved in the South. And when I, visit, every year, my mom is laid to rest there. So when I go down to visit, I can see remnants of slavery in the South, whether it's an old church, whether it's abandoned cotton fields, whether it's the plantation homes, and you can see in the back that they have the little house with the bars that are still on the windows on the bottom where they kept the slaves. There's evidence of the remnants of slavery still, in certain parts of the South. You go to the Alamo, you can see the history there of, the things that happened in that area of the country in Texas. If someone was to go to California, where can I go to kind of bear witness to some of these atrocities, that you're speaking about? What are some landmarks? What are some remnants that still remains in the region of California as it relates to the slave trade there?
Well, California is just now, with its movement towards reparation, even acknowledging that there were enslaved Africans in California. If you looked hard for sites of visible sites, one place you might find them is in the home of a woman who was enslaved in California. Her name is Biddy Mason. She's one of our heroes. And what happens is, with the gold rush, plantation owners from the South, but also slaveholders from Utah, from the Mormon community, are bringing enslaved people to California for the gold rush. Plantation owners bring 2,000 enslaved Africans across the plains or through the jungles of Panama. They were shipped down one side of Panama and are forced to carry all this mining equipment and heavy canvas tents across the Chagres River, the jungles of Panama, down to the other side, where they join thousands of miners from all over South and Latin America who are waiting for ships to carry them up to the Bay Area to head up into the Sierra Mountains for the gold rush. And Biddy Mason is brought into Southern California, into San Bernardino, a very deserty part of California, by her Mormon owners, along with another woman whose name is less familiar to us, Hannah Smith. These two women are brought by the slaveholder. Between them, during their period of enslavement, they have 11 children. We don't know who the father of these children is, but we can guess that it's their slaveholder. And they're in Los Angeles, and someone sees them, and they agree to flee with this man. They bring a lawsuit in California, and the judge, unusually, because Blacks and enslaved people were not allowed to testify in California, he brings them to a judge who creates their freedom. Biddy Mason becomes a freedom fighter for African Americans in California, and her home is still in downtown LA. Once she's free, she becomes a midwife and a nurse to her community, and she becomes a landholder, and she flips houses, and Biddy Mason makes a lot of money, and that money goes into freedom fighting for enslaved Blacks and free Blacks who were trapped by the fugitive slave law. So it was very expensive, all of those freedom suits. African Americans, Indians, and Chinese people were not allowed to testify in court. If you were a free Black in California, you couldn't enter into evidence your freedom paper, your manumission paper, and were easily taken into slavery, even if you came out free. So one place to see this story is in Biddy Mason's home, which is in downtown. Women are not supposed to cry at work, but one of the places I just lost it and wept as I wrote this book was in the archives of Sacramento, because free Blacks in California needed the right to testify. They needed to testify that enslaved Blacks were in fact in a free state, and they needed to testify about their own freedom. And they hold 3 colored conventions before the Civil War to demand their right to testify. Free Blacks circulated 8,000 petitions demanding their right to testify. And when I went into the state archives in California, and each page of these petitions only holds about 15 signatures. And as I held those petitions, I wept, because it was such a physical, visceral sense of the history of the state, and an incredible community event. This is the birth of the civil rights movement in the West, with the demand for the right to testify and the colored conventions in California. That's the birth of the civil rights movement. The money that free Blacks raised to hire white lawyers who were allowed to testify in court was huge. And so to go into the archives and physically touch the petitions that the state legislature refused to even receive and file. They followed the gag rule of Congress that said, we're not going to debate slavery. And so the California legislature's refusing to accept these papers, and to feel them in the archives is a place where you can see and touch this history.
Wow.
There's a,
Thank you for that.
yeah, thanks. There's a fifth type of category of individuals that falls into the category, I would say, of slavery. You want to talk about the convict labor?
My book is really, I believe, the first real history of San Quentin Prison and the birth of California as a carceral state. California is sending each year $1.5 billion of gold east during the gold rush. Things were crazy expensive in California. A loaf of bread cost $18. And so there was a lot of petty crime, a lot of shoplifting, things that one should not be sent to prison for that level of crime. And California doesn't have a penitentiary, it doesn't have a prison system. There are a bunch of pretty shoddy jails. One of them was in the basement of a public school. And California wants a prison system. There was no working class in California. There was nobody to do the labor on all of this land that was seized from tribal people. And so to create a system of convict labor was to create the beginnings of a working class in California. It starts with, it's a crazy story. Because of the gold rush, ship captains come out with all of these people who are going to go up into the Sierra Mountains to pan for gold. And suddenly they realize the big money is in gold. It's not in shipping gold miners. There are 400 ships abandoned in San Francisco Bay, and 2 of them become prison brigs. The state gives a contract to this corrupt dude. His name's James Edsel. They give him $100,000 to build a penitentiary. He takes the money and buys 2 of these rotten ships, retrofits them as prison brigs, and they also give him the right to hire out convicts for his own personal profit. So he is sailing these ships around San Francisco Bay. If you know California, it's a huge bay. And he's renting out these convicts to build the sewage system of San Francisco, to build the new roads of California. This is all happening really fast because of the gold rush. And he also rents them out to private wealthy people to build their mansions. Over and over again, the state calls him out and say, build the darn prison. And finally, he takes these prisoners and they have to build their own prison at San Quentin, at the north end of the bay. And that launches the carceral state. When he realizes he can't keep renting these prisoners out, he rents out San Quentin prison to factory owners. And there's a furniture factory in San Quentin. And most dangerous of all to the prisoners is a jute factory. California agriculture is bursting forth on this land that had never been spoiled by cotton, never spoiled by tobacco. And there's no laborer. The most profitable first crop in California is wheat. And wheat, if you picture it, is just going to fly around. The chaff is going to fly around. It has to be bagged. This puts the story of slavery in California into a global context, because inside San Quentin prison is a mill, a factory to stitch jute, or we'd call it burlap bags, to hold the wheat for the very wealthy new California agriculture. That jute or burlap is shipped from Calcutta in India. So it's being grown by enslaved people in India, shipped to California, and stitched in these mills inside San Quentin prison. And here the prisoners were tortured. If they refused to work on these looms, but worst of all, if they talked, the prisoners in San Quentin had to stand silently at the looms for 12 hours a day with no speaking, no leaving, just stand there and churn out, weave and stitch these jute bags to freely supply the new California industrial agriculture. So that's the birth of the prison system, and that endures today in factories inside California prisons.
Wow. I mean, that reminds me of, the whole concept of convict leasing, peonage in the South when slavery was abolished and emancipated, that those two tactics were utilized by white Southerners to keep the economic sustainability and growth that was being threatened through the loss of the slaves that they had once the emancipation of slavery and the abolishment of slavery was passed. And it sounds so those two similar. What you talked about with San Quentin is similar to convict leasing that occurred in the South. I wanted to see if you can give a distinction between slavery in the South, because you're sharing a lot of similarities, in terms of the free labor and free land that was utilized to build, I guess, generations of wealth. We see that in California, we see that in the South. What are some distinctions? What makes slavery in California a unique phenomenon? What makes it unique?
Well, there are many things that make it unique. I think in particular, if we want to focus on Southern enslavement, that one of the things that didn't happen in California that kept plantation slavery going had to do with the reproduction of a population of slaves. In 1808, the global trade in enslaved Africans to the South was supposed to come to the end. That's really dangerous because the Constitution was 20 years before that. The American Constitution gives plantation owners a 20-year free fall period to continue to buy African people from Africa, to continue that transport. And there is a rush to import as many and auction, sell, and use enslaved Africans in the plantation economy. That didn't happen in California. And what's most precarious with that, so 1808, allegedly, they're still ships, but allegedly the global slave trade in Africans is supposed to come to an end after this 20-year free fall period. What happens there is that it falls to African American women to create the next generation of enslaved Black people. And this is where you get the phrases breeding and birthing coming into the discussion of slavery, because it fell to the women, to enslaved African women, to create the next population of enslaved people to work on the plantations, either domestically in the big house or in the fields, like you describe, seeing, or in many cases, in terms of skilled labor that DeSantis is talking about now. If he uses the word blacksmith one more time, we're all going to scream. But plantation workers had many skills. Often those were the people who were chosen to come to California. It was not like plantation owners brought out thousands of people at once to California. It was very expensive to cross the plains or to buy ship tickets from Panama up to San Francisco. So people came out with 5, 10, at the most I read were 20 enslaved people. That was rare.
A lot of, from what my understanding, my reading of the history of slavery in the South, is that was true. The reproduction of the new generation of slaves, it was unfortunately perpetuated, but through the raping and of the enslaved African women to help produce a portion of that next generation of labor, free labor.
I think
can I just
I just wanted to point to one of the really disastrous loopholes that created convict labor. The 13th Amendment says ends slavery in the United States except for punishment for a crime.
Correct.
And slavery is never an appropriate punishment for a crime. so that loophole is part of one of the pillars that creates convict labor. And I feel that that legalization of slavery, of convicts forced to work with no option to do something else, no ability to leave, and for the most part, then as now, imprisoned for committing crimes and in a state that wanted their labor. This wasn't a sense of learning how to be a useful citizen.
Yeah, and that clause was never taken out. It's still there. And there's a film documentary that I use in my course at Rutgers University, Diversity and Oppression. It's a PBS film documentary called "Slavery by Another Name," and I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's by Blackman, and it really uncovers how what you just said after the 13th Amendment was passed, and that clause allowed for a lot of the peonage, a lot of the convict leasing, and other vagrant laws that kept African Americans enslaved even after the dismantling of slavery through abolishment. It's still, and I see some of the disproportionate rates of men of color, people of color in our prison systems today kind of synonymous. And I believe that it has a lot to do with that single clause, except for punishment by crime, that allows that institution to continue today.
What's the purpose of this book? What's your hope for impact? And in two particular ways of interest to me. One is, what is the knowledge of this history do in terms of our responsibility, the state's responsibility going forward? And secondly, the impact in your teaching and your students. And how are they reacting to this?
At this point, the book has only been out for 3 weeks.
Okay, all right. Well, how do you anticipate?
So I haven't had a chance, I haven't had a chance, although as I wrote this, I taught sections of it. And my students have been profoundly important to challenging me, to adding, to researching, helping. My students were along for the ride.
Interesting.
Very much so. That none of us can really produce something over 8 years that it took to do all of these different aspects of this book. We're not on a solitary, heroic journey alone. And one of the gifts of teaching is students. They can disabuse us of a lot of our bad ideas. And part of the book is to tell this history and to put our challenges into context. I'll be testifying before the Reparations Commission in a few weeks. And I believe that slavery costs. One of my goals, and maybe it's the most political, the most immediate, it certainly isn't my only goal as a historian and a teacher in sharing this history. But one of my goals is to help people explore and understand the costs of human bondage, the cost to people who aren't paid for their labor, the cost to a human body that's abused, the costs to a community where they can't find and create and raise food for their community, the costs to women of assault and child rearing, the costs of disease that's transmitted through poverty and hunger and physical abuse that comes, the cost of sexually transmitted diseases. for which people like the Chinese prostitutes were blamed for, quote, spreading disease, when in fact it was spread to them. Part of it is to really consider the costs of reparation and how we find legally justice that repairs, which is one of the definitions of reparations, justice that repairs, but also the cash, the money. It's also to help us understand that different groups of people who were enslaved in different ways have different needs now. Native American people in California want land. They want money. They want vaccines. They want books. They want decent schools on the reservations. But they also want the land that was taken through the genocide, which was to kill off California natives, to open up this new land, in part for slavery, in part for just profit. And the land was given to wealthy ranchers who agreed to convert to Catholicism by Mexico, who owns California at that moment of transition. When all of this mission land becomes available, it was given to very wealthy ranchers, and they enslaved Native Americans legally. So what different people want different things, but everybody wants their history told. I tried as best as I can to tell this book from the voices of the enslaved, to find those voices and to use the book to give access to people's own knowledge of their ancestors, of their histories. Some of their histories are not far in the past, and to help people understand that, for example, that the missions are sites of plantation slavery in California, that San Quentin, which may go through all kinds of changes from cultural exchange to low-income housing, all of these things are being debated right now in one of the most brutal prison systems in the state, to take that facility, take that incredible, beautiful land on San Francisco Bay in Marin County, and return it in some ways to people who can thrive on it and prosper from it. So part of my goal is to join those voices, but to also have a space where people can tell their own stories. I'm housed in an English department. I believe in hearing people's voices. I believe that history is a challenge to silences, and that wherever you look, if you look, under the rock, you're going to find the history of race in the United States. And part of our challenge is to look under that rock so people can tell their own stories. Some of the stories are passed down through legends, through lullabies, through songs, through sermons, through letters, through diaries. And even as an American historian and somebody who's got California in my blood, that I didn't learn this. And I don't know how to think about changing the context of race in this country without information. I'm a data geek.
Yeah.
That was really, really well put. And we're unfortunately running out of time. Kiva, I want to.
Yeah, this is great. This is really great. I'm glad you was able to share your experiences, your lived experiences, and your historical overview of what drove you to, compile the information in this book. I plan to continue to read it, and I'm looking forward to gaining more knowledge and information about how California was actually a slave state. All I focused on was the southeastern portion of this country. So this is really revelatory to me to have this new knowledge and information. So thank you so much for joining us, Gene. Thank you all for listening again, and to all our viewers for joining us for another Race to Social Justice podcast. Please make sure that you subscribe to our channel, and we look forward to continuing to run this race with you on our next episode. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The Race to Social Justice podcast is produced, edited, and mixed at The Dream in Austin, Texas. Visit thedreamrecordingstudio.com for more info.